We would like to take a look today at many of the issues that were raised in the recent op-ed piece by Jeffrey D. Sachs. He starts his piece by saying that the big lie of the Trump administration is that China is the cause of America's problems. He continues that this plays into American smugness, that if China's succeeding, they must be cheating, end quote. We would like to point out that it isn't about succeeding. How does one define success when it concerns China? Recent successes are particularly confounding. Successfully releasing a virus? Yes, absolutely. China is the cause of their own problems in this point, and now it has affected the global community. The fact of the matter is that whoever we choose to blame or in what way we choose to hold certain parties accountable, it does not mean that China is not the cause of the problems. It's an undeniable fact that China is the cause of the problems. If the virus was in fact released on purpose from a Wuhan lab, China is the cause of the problems. If the virus was accidentally leaked as a result of lax safety standards, China is the cause of the problems. If the virus originated in a wet market, as the government has always maintained, China is still the cause of the problems. The fact of the matter, for anyone wondering, is that the virus did originate in China, and therefore China is the cause of the problems. Now, whether or not they should be held accountable for our own response to the pandemic is perhaps a trickier issue. We also take issue with the way that Mr. Sachs seems to assume that America is pursuing accountability for China based on a smug concept of jealousy. That's quite a large assumption to make. In his op-ed piece, Mr. Sachs also frequently refers to the right-wing allies that seem to be behind this movement to hold China accountable. We find it strange that anyone would refer to any ally who considers holding the Chinese Communist Party to be a positive action, a right-wing ally. That's quite a large assumption and also seems to make this argument far more partisan than it needs to be. It's also extremely insulting to the many independent Chinese journalists who have suffered extreme consequences as a result of saying similar things to what the Trump administration has put forth. In his piece, Mr. Sachs also references Dr. Fauci. He quotes that the Five Eyes intelligence agencies have poured cold water on Trump's claim. While we would argue that as we have not yet seen the findings, it is hard to say they pour cold water on the claim, we would also put forth that Dr. Fauci is not an expert with the intelligence community and therefore perhaps is commenting above his pay grade. Mr. Sachs has many references to McCarthyism, and we find that quite intriguing. While it's true that hysteria that labels people as part of a group and automatic enemies of the state is something we should all be wary of, we find that China is the nation that is committing these offenses. In China, 3 million Uyghurs are currently held in concentration camps and sent out to factories for forced labor based merely upon the fact of their ethnicity and the beliefs associated with it. This method of treating people as state enemies is in fact something that China is guilty of and understands far better than we do. To point out that the concept of McCarthyism is in any way applicable here, we also have to acknowledge that we are in a Cold War of sorts with China. As many espouse the quote-unquote dangerous rhetoric that the Trump administration is putting forth towards aggravating tensions with China, we must remember that some of this is inevitable. It is not something that anyone should pursue deliberately, but as a result of China's negligent and deceptive actions, our own actions are in many ways deemed necessary. Unfortunately, continuing to blindly throw around these type of accusations also ignores the fact that the type of communism we find in China is not delegated simply to their own borders. China's long arm has now extended into every country of the world and into many academic institutions. This form of communism is extremely dangerous because it fails to recognize any human's right to question the party line. Mr. Sachs puts forth in his article even that, as we do not have proof of where the virus originated, perhaps it was brought into the Wuhan market by an infected individual traveling from Western China. It seems to us that he is aware of something that no one else is, as we haven't heard much along that line. Perhaps he would care to elaborate on where he gets this information from. While at the current stage, many of us are familiar with the brave actions of Dr. Li, who was a whistleblower at the very beginning of the outbreak in China, There are a few who are willing to also reference the many Chinese journalists who are currently missing. In his op-ed piece, Mr. Sachs seems quite willing to give the Chinese government a pass. In fact, he chalks up many of their actions due to the harmless desire to not disrupt the Chinese New Year celebrations. It seems that he's willing to attribute all of these quote-unquote missteps to a lack of experience in dealing with something of this magnitude. While many would also take issue with that argument, since China in fact has quite a bit of experience in dealing with deadly viruses, and in fact also has a lot of experience in covering them up. The most important point to remember about all of this is that it's quite convenient to exonerate someone's name after they're already dead and can't make any more trouble. Mr. Sachs is even so blatant as to pull Huawei into the argument and reference that some of our close allies have gone in a different direction than us, continuing to do business with Huawei and to cooperate more generally with China. We find it interesting that he managed to work it into this piece. It seems a convenient way to drum up business for China. We who are part of advocating for the Uyghur community do not find it comforting that because of an economic decision or money, we can choose to ignore China's deception. This reason in and of itself might show Mr. Sachs' true character and what he considers the most important. The question that we are asking as a result of all of this, in fact, is whether or not our own government responded competently. We think that that question is beside the point. We can seek accountability for our government officials and at the same time hold China accountable for what they did and did not do. Is the global high death toll because of our president and his administration? Is it because of a failure to implement certain authoritarian policies? Is it a failure of the American people to comply, in combination with a refusal on the part of China to share relevant samples? Either way, we cannot deny what China has done. They have oppressed whistleblowers. Many journalists have gone missing. They have continued to lie, and they have not cooperated with international requests for transparency during the whole few months of the globe dealing with this pandemic. The point of our addressing these questions is not, in fact, to excuse anyone from responsibility, including our own government. However, we desire that the American people would recognize that they are failing to see the forest for the trees. It is essential to the human rights and dignity of people across the globe that China be held accountable for its deliberate deception to the international community. Perhaps much of our problem in the West is that we assume that other people are playing by the same rule book that we are. In fact, in a Western society, the lack of visible guilt, we might assume the opposite to be true. In a court of law, we find that a lack of evidence should result in an inability to convict. Does this therefore prove the defendant innocent? In a court of law, perhaps by the letter of law, yes, but the reality is that with a lack of evidence, some of the guilty do go free. Consequently, as we fail to see the evidence that we are looking for, we search in desperation for a scapegoat. Someone must bear responsibility for these horrors that have killed hundreds of thousands across the globe. And therein, Mr. Sachs' willingness to address these problems is not in and of itself a problem. But herein lies another major problem. China does not operate by the same court of law and system that we do. There's a common saying that's used to refer to China. They have the application of law without rule by law. What does that mean? Once again, in these present situations, we do find that many fail to understand the reality of China, that they are not playing by the same rules that any of us are. As an American, we may look at the absence of evidence as the proof of innocence, or at least the proof that we do not need to pursue further justice. We often hold the viewpoint that we should focus on our own imperfect nation before we address the issues elsewhere. Why is holding China accountable presented as antithetical to holding our own government responsible for the virus response? It is essential that citizens across the globe rise up and say that because of the lack of transparency, the continuing crackdown on their own citizens, independent journalists, and minority people groups across China, China is not a trustworthy ally or friend to anyone across the world. For the sake of the Chinese people, for the sake of the people persecuted by the Chinese government, and for the sake of all those who love freedom across the globe, we call on people to be aware and to recognize the truth of the wolf in sheep's clothing.